It's a real pleasure for me as the president of the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, the Free, to be connected with SOAS and the New School for Social Research in what I think is a very timely project that hopefully will help empower and participate many different people from all walks of life in this very moment in which the violence of our economic system is showing its most naked face. It's not just the genocide and the plunder that we are witnessing in Palestine. It's the criminalization of poverty, not just the United States, but everywhere in the world. And it's this moment in which everyone is realizing that this economy is not working for the people, but for bottom lines that are really only flavoring very, very few at the expense of the many. So it's in this moment that we really need categories and concepts that can try to break away from a lot of the knowledge that has helped reinforce our passive acceptance of our economy. And economists have been very guilty in participating in this phase of basically silencing of people. And I think it's really a chance for us to use knowledge in a more empowering way and go against a lot of this knowledge that we take for granted, but is actually not helping us at all be awake for the transformations that are happening and that we need to be able to tackle in a very aware way. So this is why this first panel speaks loads to what empowering knowledge can do. We have the pleasure of having two scholars who I admire extremely and who I've had the pleasure of collaborating with for years now. We will begin with Steve Maher, and then I will introduce Professor Richard Wolff. So let me just briefly introduce Steve Maher. And before I do that, I would like to say, of course, the title of the talk is The Changing World Order, Tariffs, Trade Wars, and More. And what is interesting about this panel is that we will see how even within the Marxian framework, there are different interpretations of recent phenomenon and their reasons for their manifestation. And indeed, the question of whether all this outmost emergence of authoritarianism, the violence in the economy, and militarism is the outcome of the strength of capital and empire, or is it actually the visible demonstration of its decline? This, I think, is a fundamental question for us to be able to actually be capable of interpreting the most recent events. So we have first Steve, who will be telling us a story about how it's the strength of capital that produces these contradictions. And Steve Maher is assistant professor of economics at SUNY Cortland and co-editor of the Socialist Register. He earned his PhD from York University in Toronto, Canada. And he also teaches at the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, where he was visiting professor. He is the author of a wonderful book published in 2024 with Verso called The Fall and Rise of American Finance, from JP Morgan to BlackRock. It's really a book that can inspire many, again, to rethink, even within the Marxian tradition, certain knowledge that we thought was fixed and unchallengeable. And he does an amazing job. His first book was with Palgrave in 2022 and was called Corporate Capitalism and the Integral State, General Electric, and a Century of American Power. So the floor is yours, Steve. We're so happy to have you. You have 15 minutes, and then I will introduce Richard Wolff. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Clara. And thanks to Juani and everybody else involved in organizing this incredibly important initiative. As Clara mentioned, this is now more than ever, it's really important to be able to have these spaces to have such conversations that are so timely and so pressing. So I want to start by just pointing out that, by challenging, I think, the conventional view that Trump's tariffs, which have been widely interpreted as a reaction by capital to American decline. The typical starting point of this analysis is the argument that financialization has hollowed out the productive economy by draining investment away from industry and towards a parasitic and speculative financial activities, harming not only workers through the decline of industrial employment and so on, and good jobs, and the elimination of good jobs, but also their bosses, the industrial capitalists that are experiencing the predation of this exploitative and parasitic financial class. This decline, the argument goes, has now been amplified by the rise of a more dynamic China, which has challenged the US on the world stage for geopolitical supremacy. The implication of this argument can be politically that workers and industrial capitalists both share an interest, a common interest in reviving American capitalism, and that this is the key to defeating Trump. So the left should be oriented towards finding ways to revive and revitalize American capitalism, which comes with, or is intrinsically comes with a kind of strong working class and more equitable distribution of income. I argue, on the contrary, that Trump didn't emerge from capitalist decline, but from a political crisis produced by the strength of capital. So not an economic malaise, not economic decay, not economic decline, but a political crisis that is rooted in the contradictions of the strength of capital and the success of accumulation. So on the eve of Trump's election, The Economist proclaimed the US economy was bigger and better than ever. The Financial Times declared that it was, quote, soaring ahead of its rivals and had become, quote, the envy of the developed world. By 2020, profits had not only recovered from one of the deepest crises in history in 2008, but had actually reached historic highs. Productivity growth returned a bit more slowly following the crisis, but also by the 2010s had reached its fastest pace in 2 decades. So if this is decline, I think capitalists would have been surprised to hear that, because they're making money hand over fist. Indeed, capital was quite skeptical of Trump's destabilizing impact on the empire, and strongly favored Biden-Harris and the Democratic Party as the kind of standard bearers of neoliberal globalization. Harris's campaign was the fastest campaign in American history to raise $1 billion, just 80 days after she announced that she would be the Democratic candidate, which was the most lucrative fundraising quarter in American political history. The only problem was that she couldn't win the election. And I think this observation is critical to understand the nature of the crisis, because the crisis stems precisely from the fact that capital does not directly control the state. If it did, things would have gone differently. The state is relatively autonomous from capital. It is a political representative of the general interests of the system as a whole, but not directly under the control of any individual capitalist or group of capitalists. And moreover, it's formally democratic. However undemocratic we know the capitalist state may be, formally speaking, it's democratic. And so that invites populist backlash and can express a populist backlash against capitalism. So the US empire had, by all appearances, been highly beneficial for capital. This empire initially emerged following World War II as the United States, as the American state took on a unique role in making a global capitalism, not separate national capitalisms, not regional capitalisms, but one globally integrated capitalism, interconnected through cross-border flows of trade and investment. The United States came to govern an informal empire comprised of formally independent and sovereign states interconnected through these economic relationships, and came to express the general interests of the global capitalist system as a whole. And the rise of finance was actually key to this. It was an institutional foundation of the US empire, not a sign of its decline or weakness, which facilitated the free movement of investment internationally and tied together this global system. So finance was all about increasing the competitiveness, increasing the interconnection of the global system. But however profitable it may have been, global integration also led to the devastation of industrial regions. It led to growing precariousness on the part of the American working class and the defeat of labor. It led to the concentration of wealth, and it depended upon the imposition of austerity by an increasingly authoritarian state. All of the very grievances that Trump would later mobilize. So these were outcomes or underpinnings of the success and profitability of global capitalism in the American empire and the forms of class discipline that were required to sustain it. It was after 2008, the 2008 crisis, long-standing festering discontent with the political and social institutions, political and economic institutions governing American society and the global capitalism, erupted into a full-blown legitimacy crisis. This was rooted in the collapse of industrial employment, which really started in 2001, with the so-called China shock, as China was brought into the WTO. But that sharp drop in industrial employment accelerated after 2008 very sharply and impacted very significantly whole regions of the United States. It also, the 2008 crisis also had a severe impact on a petty bourgeoisie that was very closely tied to the housing sector. And the housing boom itself was part of the process of financialization that underpinned global capitalist integration. And also a very harsh impact of that crisis on small capitalists. On the eve of Trump's election, corporations were raking in record profits while labor's share of national income plummeted to its lowest level in a quarter century. So these harmful impacts of the crisis in terms of the expansion of a surplus population, 1/3 of the working age male population was excluded from the labor force altogether by the time Trump came to be reelected in just recently in 2024. That persisted despite the recovery from the 2008 crisis. So the surplus population is expanding, precarity is expanding, the inequality is expanding, and corporations are raking in record profits all at the same time. So this is persisting through the recovery from 2008. And indeed, the impact of the COVID-19 closures and the return of inflation after 2021 all continue to worsen the social conditions for broad swaths of the population, ultimately creating the conditions whereby Trump could become president. As Marx put it, what we saw in the period since 2008 was nothing other than the accumulation of wealth at one pole and the accumulation of misery at the opposite pole. And yet at the same time, capital was unwilling to engage in the kinds of class compromises with workers, social democratic compromises that could have re-legitimated accumulation. So the pressures of global integration and liberalized financial flows created a situation where capital could not be compelled to enter into the kind of class distributional bargains that had legitimated capitalism in the past and might have re-legitimated it in the lead up to Trump's election. This resulted in a polarization of options. Either workers could undertake a radical confrontation with capital to move toward more democratic control over investment, or face continued globalization. In this context, the marginalization of the left meant that it was unable to provide a plausible path out of the crisis, leaving the hard right as the primary social force able to capitalize on the resentments and contradictions of the uneven development of globalization to come to power. Trump was elected by blaming bad trade deals to gain power within a state that is still formally democratic and relatively autonomous from capital. So Trump then is now, having been elected on this platform of blaming previous administrations' bad trade deals, which were very profitable for capital, he's now attempting to use the substantial autonomy of the executive of the American state, which was a bulwark of globalization, insulating the core centers of state power from popular intervention, sustaining austerity and sustaining global liberalization. He's now using that very autonomy to carry out his agenda. So only by adjusting the costs and the benefits of empire can Trump possibly hope to appease business while also satisfying his fractious base. But this won't be easy. So he's working to build support among capital by offsetting damaging tariffs with massive tax breaks while ruthlessly attacking the working class. Meanwhile, he's trying to appease workers, the petty bourgeoisie, and small capital with nationalism and promises of offshoring. And it's all going to be very difficult to pull off, to say the least. Of course, tariffs are also about containing China, which is a bipartisan objective, not one that's just limited to the hard right. Clearly, it's the case that the economic development of China has led it to demand a larger say in shaping world order and the structure of the US empire. But it's important to note that the rise of China is not correlated in any zero-sum way with US decline. Indeed, FDI flows, the flows of foreign investment from the US into China, have continued precisely because US firms are capturing a very significant share of the productivity gains in China. So as wages rise and Chinese productivity grows, it's US firms that are capturing a very significant share of those gains. So this is not in any kind of zero-sum opposition to the American, to the power of American capitalism or the American capitalist class. But China, of course, is demanding a larger say in shaping world order. And so, unlike the inter-imperial rivalry that we saw in the interwar period in the pre-World War I era, or the external conflict between the U.S. and the USSR that characterized the Cold War era, the integration of China within global capitalism means that decoupling is not really an option. And so containing it is extremely difficult. And this will be a very serious challenge for the US empire, trying to find a way to contain the rise of China, even though its integration makes decoupling from it extremely challenging. So Trump's tariffs will undoubtedly encourage other states to carve out more autonomous economic and political space in the world system, including alternative currency zones. But it's important to note that such projects are still a very, very long way off from establishing a real alternative to the dollar. China's financial system remains tightly controlled by the state. It lacks the liquidity that could allow the renminbi to serve as world money. And if the emergence of rivals to the dollar is still a very, very long way off, even if China's share of reserves are growing. The BRICS and the euro have other issues we can discuss as well. So even as Trump is shaking the system, the US state for now still anchors world money and global accumulation. And Trump will necessarily have to accommodate the continued strength of capital and the structural limits of capitalism. Tariffs are going to have to be implemented so as not to jeopardize the competitiveness of American multinationals. Many are going to have to be rolled back or wielded as leverage to force other states to further liberalize or enhance market access for U.S. firms. Insofar as these tariffs lead to chaos or even economic crisis, delegitimate the empire, or push other countries to make self-protecting adjustments and retaliate, they risk the empire's future, and capital will respond appropriately or respond in kind. So far, capital has adopted a wait-and-see attitude and allowed Trump the space to pursue his international and domestic agendas, which are basically aggressive bullying abroad and the construction of a neo-fascist authoritarian state at home. So all of this highlights the bankruptcy of the Democrats as an opposition force. They are sitting around and waiting for Trump to collapse rather than challenging him. They believe they can sweep back into power by holding together the broadest possible coalition of big capital, which will inevitably, they believe, become alienated by Trump's chaos and back their return to the White House and in Congress in the upcoming midterm elections. The question becomes, at what point and under what conditions would some part of capital break to the hard right? And indeed, this may already be happening with parts of the tech sector and finance. So indeed, just as Trump is worsening the political crisis from which he's benefiting, the hard right also offers a possible option to resolve that crisis, a hard right resolution to that crisis. So the question is, under what conditions would a part of big capital break to the hard right and back that kind of resolution to the legitimacy crisis? So this means that substantial popular disruption is needed to get the attention of sections of big capital that may still be movable and raise the cost of embracing the right. But such mass disruption must go beyond one-off strikes or protest actions, which may win concessions but can't be sustained. Unions need to move from complaints to protest to a crusade that goes beyond pushing for a return to the Biden status quo ante. We need to be clear that tariffs alone are not enough. We need more democratic control over investments. It's workers that are going to primarily pay the cost of tariffs through higher prices and ultimately the austerity that will have to be brought to bear to maintain, to protect global supply chains and protect the value of the dollar. So meaningfully breaking with globalization can't really be done with the stroke of a pen. Tariffs alone are not going to do this. It requires an extensive industrial policy to support onshoring, not to mention the creation of a labor rights regime that's supportive of workers. So this again raises the question of what happens with the capital that stays at home. And it points to the need for greater planning on the part of the state over what happens with capital, what happens with investment. So Trump is not a sign that capitalism is broken and in need of being fixed. He is the political outcome of its strength. Unfortunately for us, ecocide and the immiseration of the working class are not signs that capitalism is on the ropes. They are testaments to its continued strength. Fighting Trump, therefore, can't mean restoring capitalism. It requires finding ways to build the capacity of the working class to confront and transcend it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that insightful talk. It was very dense, And I know you used also a lot of language that is quite academic. So after Rick speaks, maybe we can try to unpack it a little bit to reach also broader audiences to give full importance of what you said. So Dr. Richard Wolff is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and now is visiting professor at the New School for Social Research in New York. He has an incredible weekly radio show and podcast called Economic Update. That is and that you can find at www.democracyatwork.info. And in fact, Democracy at Work, that you can find also on social media, is a platform that really is successfully reaching broad audience in a way that I think is probably the number one in terms of critical thinking in the United States. So it's really an interesting phenomenon that you can follow very closely. Richard has an enormous amount of scholarship and books. I'm just going to mention the latest one, just published in 2024, called Understanding Capitalism, that I also use with my students and is a very good introduction to all of the key issues that we're facing today. Rick, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes, and I would love to see what your reaction to Steve's ideas are.
Okay, let me begin with a parable. As a member of the economics profession, I have always been struck by the capacity of my colleagues, not all of them, thankfully, but most of them, to engage in what common people call cherry picking your statistic. In other words, making a case and then going and finding a few numbers scattered around the government reports that make things look like they're going in your direction. And then having a meeting with somebody who picked different ones and came up with a different analysis. I always thought that the parallel example would be a doctor. It's always true that some parts of your body are looking like you're in good shape. And then there are the other parts of your body that make it look like you're not. And if you look at only the one or the other, you will get the one or the other view. But what you really want from the doctor is an assessment of the balances. As a student of Marx, that's what I thought he was teaching us to do, to look at the system, in this case, capitalism, to notice where it has signs of growth and strength, and then to notice where it has signs of failure and decline, and then come up with some sort of assessment of the balance. You might expect, for example, that early on the balance would be more pluses than minuses, and later in life the balance shifts. It's always a balance, but it shifts. That's the framework within which I'm going to make my case. Okay, so I believe we are living through, you and I, we are living through an inflection point in the history of the world and in the history of the capitalist system. I think the center of economic dynamism and growth for capitalism has left the West and moved to the East. It isn't located in Britain or Europe or North America or Japan anymore. It is now located in India and China and Brazil and all places like that. Not only has the center of capitalist dynamism moved, it's also changed, which is consistent with having moved. That is, it has gotten a dose of a recognition, contrary to its earlier idea that to break away from feudalism required the demand for laissez-faire. Leave me alone, let me be, which is what laissez-faire in French means. And it was in French because it was directed against the absolute monarchies which were the decline of feudalism. By the way, a decline of feudalism that mixed extraordinary strength with extraordinary vulnerability. And when the balance shifted, the people with the extraordinary strength lost their heads and had to give way to the people who had, they thought, been conquered. Okay, keep it in mind. We'll come back to it at the conclusion. The change as you move to the East is that the role of the state becomes progressively more and more important. It becomes clear to more and more people that the failures of the private capitalist sector to meet all kinds of needs can at least be partially rectified by bringing the state in, not just to offset the collapse, the cyclical breakdowns, the 1929s, but also the increasingly frequent failures to solve all kinds of social problems which the private sector cannot or will not, and the state can be brought in to save the situation. It's a little risky. You have to forego some of your laissez-faire ideology, but it's a necessity. And so I think we are living through a decline involving movement geographically and change in that balance between state and private. And these are earth-shaking transformations for which the world was not well prepared. And as a citizen of the United States, I can assure you that the United States is not only unprepared to go through what I'm describing, but its basic reaction to it to this point has been denial. It's a mass psychology of pretense that it isn't there. Absolutely, the leaders of the country, especially if they're in power, think the economy is in wonderful shape. They tend to be a little more critical when they're out of power, and then the song shifts once they win the power and the roles get reversed. Mr. Biden kept telling us the economy was in great shape. His leading spokespeople used to tell us that there was a peculiar problem, that polls showed that the mass of people didn't think the economy was in good shape, when it clearly was. How did he know? Look at the stock market. And the conclusion that my colleagues at the elite universities of this country reached was that the mass of the people are stupid. They don't read the right journals. They don't have the statistics at their fingertips. Well, nowadays, they still say that, but it's harder and harder. The realities of decline are actually now beginning to settle into the population. And the decline is now being used as a new lens with which to look at the history. And just to give you an example, the United States had a war in Vietnam against the Communist Party of North Vietnam. The United States lost. The people who run that country are the people who were on the other side in that war. They won, we lost. In Afghanistan, the enemy was the Taliban. Who runs Afghanistan? The Taliban. They won, we lost. Iraq, same thing. Ukraine, about to be the same thing. We keep losing, and it's sinking in to the American population, slowly, very slowly, that we are a loser in this global situation. But far more important than that is the rise of China and the BRICS. This is a fundamental new phenomena for the United States and its empire. It never had an economic competitor. It came in World War II after the old empires had destroyed one another totally, giving the United States carte blanche to go in there and reorganize the world for itself. And for 30 to 40 years, it worked. And then the old combatants recovered, and you couldn't do it anymore. And you had to rearrange your economy. And they tried. And for 30 to 40 years, they did a reasonably good job. It wasn't successful, but it kept the system going. The biggest price was to bring in the Chinese and the rest of the world, bring them in enough so that the Chinese could develop independently of the West to at least a partial degree that other countries could not or did not do. Here at home, the only sustaining quality that kept capitalism going was a level of credit that now haunts it at a moment's notice. It could all collapse. Americans are in levels of debt, and not just Americans as individuals. Record levels of household debt, record levels of corporate debt, record levels of government debt. The debt is spectacular in terms of the vulnerability it creates. And if you follow such things, the chaos on the stock market last Friday should give you an example of how shaky it all is. And what does that then mean for us? Well, in my judgment, it has historic implications. Because the capitalism that left the West as the dynamic center and moved east and changed from predominantly private to a hybrid, if you like, private and state mixed together under the control of a powerful state and a powerful communist party, did not change, did not question something which, as Marxists, it strikes me, now becomes part of our agenda. Because if you look closely, you'll notice that the organization of the enterprise, whether it's in Chicago or in Shanghai, is an organization that has an employer group at the top, public, private, mixture, and a mass of employees underneath them. The employer-employee model remains the organization at the micro level of enterprise. It's as if you had had a shift from private slavery to state slavery, or from private feudalism to state feudalism, and used that change to suggest that slavery was gone because the state was doing it, or feudalism was gone because the state, but we never did that. We knew better. But we've gotten deflected into imagining that when the state and the private change their relative importance within a employer-employee model, we've actually left capitalism. We haven't. Not yet. The changes to state may be powerful, may be important, but they have left undealt with an underlying problem which, as students of Marx, is important for us. Namely, what is the structure of the relationship in production between the employer and the employee? In my judgment, the collapse of Western capitalism, its transition to Eastern, its change from more private to more state, are an interesting concentration of power You might use phrases like concentration and centralization, and they bespeak both kinds of strength and vulnerability and weakness, not either or, both. And the interesting thing for us is to wonder whether or not a kind of solidarity could be developed here in the West with our counterparts in the East, because we have something in common, a class structure of the enterprise which we can oppose and go beyond together. And that makes us stronger than we will otherwise be, because we might have a shared agenda of the transformation at the micro level that we have been waiting for ever since Marx taught us early in the 19th century that that was a core part of what this capitalist system is all about. Feudalism collapsed when arguably it had taken the concentration and centralization of power and wealth to unheard of degrees. Louis XIV or Louis XVI could say to us, I am the Sun King. Not only could he did. I am the most powerful. Who could build a Versailles like me? And then in a few months, he was gone. We're at that point also. Our system is shaking. And as a footnote, I would only say to you, I am sitting here in Manhattan, in the middle of New York City. And unless something very strange happens, in a few days, we're going to elect a socialist to be the mayor of this city. The changes that are happening are very deep, very fast, and they bespeak a system in very deep trouble. Last point. The word I would use to describe Mr. Trump and his government is the word desperate. They are desperate to find a way out of their decline. Oh, they will talk a lot. We are the tough guys. Look at them blowing people up in boats in the Caribbean 1,000 miles away. Look at the bluster. Look at the fakery. Every leader in every country on earth is now going to be able to blame the United States and its tariffs for whatever their economic problems are. They're already busy doing it. And if I had time, which I don't, I would take this argument and make it even stronger for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was incredibly illuminating. So I would like to try to pin down exactly how the two analyses the two of you propose differ or actually sometimes have actually things in common. And what seems to me is that Steve is decoupling the economic from the political a little bit more than you are, Rick, in the sense that Steve is telling us that it's through this enormous economic strength that the political crisis emerges, because in a way the political crisis, tell me if I'm interpreting it correctly, but the political crisis that is what allowed Trump to get elected in the first place, and as Steve was putting it, is actually like what he is escalating, is this outcome of an economic strength that, and tell me if I'm putting it in putting words that are not yours in your mouth. But the point is that this very economic strength required as a condition to happen, this disciplining of the working class that is then really coming out as the political crisis. I mean, the conditions for the economic strength and this exorbitant amount of profits being made and accumulation in the hands of very, very few require this disciplining of the working class that is then, though, what produces this political crisis. Am I understanding you correctly? While Rick seems to be more focused on the political crisis as more all-encompassing, and thus focusing on this as the element of decline. That's my first question is, did I say something that makes sense to you? Would you see your positions as differing from one another? And then let me just ask all the questions together. Oh, well, let's start with this, and then I have a follow-up after. Let's start with this one.
Should I go?
You can start. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think what you just said, Clara, is pretty much hit right on the head. I mean, the way I'm trying to frame the problem is basically that clearly we know that there's a social crisis. Social conditions have become, intolerable for broad swaths of the population. We've had an incredible social fragmentation, the marginalization of huge portion of the working class into a surplus population that's excluded from wage labor altogether. So 30% of the male population right now of working age men in the United States are outside of the workforce altogether. So even as we see unemployment numbers falling, that population continues to grow. And this is precisely the dynamic that Marx laid out in Capital, which is the accumulation of wealth at one pole and the accumulation of misery at the other pole, right? The strength of capitalism, and we can go into the mechanics of how that works, tends to create a surplus population. It tends to immiserate the working class. It tends to be predicated on, especially absent a strong working class movement, it tends to be predicated on the making life harder for the working class, defeating the working class. And so I think we need to separate the conditions of the working class from the conditions of capital, because very often the strength of capital is predicated on making conditions for working class people even worse. And so that can create problems for governing capitalism, right? Because ultimately you need to find a way of generating some level of consent for capitalist class rule, what Gramsci called hegemony, right? You need some level of consent. You can't just rule through naked coercion. You need to legitimate class rule. And so the way that happens in the American state today is through elections primarily, which have been hollowed out and weakened, and the state's been de-democratized very thoroughly over the course of the neoliberal period to protect austerity and to maintain class discipline. But the crisis is afflicting those mechanisms of political rule because of the impact of the strength of capital, the successive accumulation, which has created a situation in which it is extremely difficult to organize consent for that class rule because of the kind of suffering and difficult situation for the working class that Professor Wolff is laying out. So I think we need to see the state as the locus of the crisis, and that requires understanding the state as something that is not just unified, a unified expression of a coherent capitalist class, but as the result of political contestation and conflict between different social forces and actors. And so the capitalist class has one set of interests. The marginalized surplus populations have a different set of interests. Immiserated workers have a different set of interests. Small shopkeepers who were hammered by the 2008 crisis have a different set of interests. And they can all come to be expressed within this formally democratic state in ways that are dysfunctional for maintaining capitalist rule. That's the point I'm trying to make. Capitalists cannot rule directly. They're the only ruling class. Professor Wolff mentioned feudalism. Capitalists are the only ruling class in history that is unable to directly rule. Why? Because individual capitalists might not even see themselves as part of a class. For all they know, in their own consciousness, they're only interested in their own bottom lines of their own firms, and they're competing with every other capitalist. So that requires a state to balance the interests of different individual capitalists and articulate the general long-term interests of the system as a whole. And that requires that the state represent the long-term interests of capital as a whole. And that can become the site of dysfunction and crisis, precisely because of the kinds of social contradictions that stem from healthy accumulation, the successive accumulation, that I was trying to lay out. So it's the strength of capital, ironically, that's the source of the problem, because it makes it very difficult to legitimate the system and to maintain its rule. And so that I think is how I would kind of elaborate on the crisis. And I think there's a lot of overlap between the kinds of conditions that Professor Wolff is laying out and what I'm seeing as well. But it's just a different context, I think, to place those conditions in.
Thank you, Steve. Rick, your response, because clearly you understand it not as the strength of capital, but as the decline of you're making more of a point about the American empire, maybe separate from capital more broadly, or how could we understand this divergences analysis between strength and weakness that we're discussing?
Well, in the United States that I was born in and lived and worked all my life in to this moment, the number one legitimating phenomena among many, but the number one was a standard of living provided to the working class that made them feel that they were in a special place, that the United States was exceptional, that the rest of the world, whom they could glimpse on television in natural geographic magazine colors and lenses, was way, way behind, that they enjoyed being in the great middle class. Sure, there were a few desperately poor people somewhere and a few very rich ones, but the rest of us all were together in a vast middle class. You had that bizarre coming together of ideology in the United States and in parts of the Soviet Union, because they both claimed they were in classless societies, although they meant it a little differently. They did share the language. The problem for America, and I believe that that was the key legitimating quality, that's gone. That's over. That's not there anymore. And that has pulled the rug out from under. The genius of Mr. Trump was that he saw that as an opportunity, and he was right, because the Bush family in the Republican Party and the Clintons and the Obamas in the Democratic Party didn't, their level of denial was so complete, they had to pretend none of that was happening. And they kept going in the same cheerleading, and the whole population left them. And that's why Kamala Harris did so poorly, having raised a lot of money. What difference did it make? She was pushing a dead line. And here again, I'm going to use New York City. We have a representative of the traditional Republicans, Mr. Bloomberg, our ex-mayor, a billionaire. And we have Mr. Cuomo, a dyed-in-the-wool representative of the Obama, Clinton, and they're dead in the water. They have no influence. They couldn't prevent a bearded, no disrespect, Steve, a bearded Muslim socialist from wiping the floor with them. He's not going to be elected by a little. He is winning by a lot. There is no, the whole city, even if he loses next time in the election in a few weeks, he will have come further than anyone dreamed he could. And the reason, with all due respect, he's a great young man, Zoran Mamdani is a good candidate. This is not a critique. But people are not flocking to him because he's a Muslim or because he's a socialist. They're flocking to him because the alternatives are dead. They have no appeal, no charisma, no any. It's the old dead, and that's all he has to say. I'm new, I'm young, I'm different. And that's it. Oh, we'll try you because the others are dead. So for me, Mr. Trump is doing the same thing. This gambit of hitting the whole world with tariffs, what kind of craziness is this? Every leader, let me repeat this, every leader in every country now has a prima facie way to excuse his or her own behavior. I'm having troubles here in the Netherlands. I'm having trouble here in Paraguay. I'm having trouble here in Malaysia. It's because Mr. Trump, he has isolated the United States. He thought he was isolating Russia or China. He wasn't. He's isolating them. If you add up the GDP, little exercise, of the United States, the G7, it's way less, the total, than the GDP of China and the BRICS. Not even close. It's over. Every little country in the world, every company is right now recalculating their plans, their strategies, their investments, their borrowing, their growth. And you know what they're doing? Downgrading the United States and the West and upgrading the East. That's where the deals are made. That's where the railroads are built. It's over the American empire. And it's only the question, how will the United States manage it? Chances are poorly. And what will that mean? It'll mean that we will be looking in a few years like Great Britain already looks, which is an economic and political disaster that only gets worse because it indulges itself in the lunatic idea, all due respect to our hosts in Britain right now, but to blame Europe for your problems, to have a Brexit, and then to discover now, 10 years later, that that wasn't a very good idea. That's not the problem, that it wasn't a good idea. It was purely an effort to avoid dealing with what it means when you're no longer the empire of the world. You're a small offshore island of the continent of Europe. And you got to come to terms with that. And the United States is still strong and still powerful. All that's correct. The dollar is not what it was 30 years ago, not even close. But it's still the single most important currency. But it's the decline that's obvious. Central banks around the world, they're all reducing their dollar holdings, some more, some less. But they're now looking at gold. Look at what's happened to gold, a perfect measure of the decline of the capitalist system. One last point. All kinds of people in the United States are responding to the authoritarian turn of Mr. Trump, except the billionaire class, the high-tech moguls in Silicon Valley. They are not saying anything. They are hoping that the switch to an economic nationalism is going to catch hold, and they've put their money, and that's where the money is, they've bet on Mr. Trump. They are abandoning the other formations. The United States Chamber of Commerce has been critical of the tariffs from the beginning, but they just don't count anymore. Why? Because the political leadership is going down with the billionaires. And they don't, you give them a tax cut the way he did, they will let him do whatever he wants with immigrants. Again, the boats in the Caribbean, I don't mean to harp on it, but people don't miss that. There are now 4 of them, or maybe 5, where the United States government has decided that there are some people in a boat 1,000 miles away, and they are engaged, the government says, in the drug traffic. So the government went and killed them all. No arrest, no trial, no lawyer, no jury, no. And I want to remind you, being engaged in the drug traffic in the United States is not a capital crime. We haven't executed anyone for the drug business, and we arrest people every day in this country for that. So what? And no one says anything. The people who run what's left of the capitalist class in this country are in bed with Mr. Trump. They've put their marbles there. They're ready to go. And if we're not very careful, we will all be dust because they will take it to the end because they are that crazy. What they're doing to Mexico, Canada, and Europe, if you follow it, I mean, ally schmally, we're done. We're going to whack you all into tributaries, or we're not going to let the game be played. I think that's why Mr. Xi Jinping dances carefully. They know what they're dealing with, and I think we have to know too.
Thank you, Rick. Absolutely. So it seems that the message here, given that the topic is tariffs, is that this is just the issue here is distracting from much deeper problems. So what you have in common, and Steve and Rick, is clearly the idea that we need to demystify the liberal discussion about tariffs as being the problem because blocking supposed harmonious and dynamic trade, and looking at what is happening that is at level that is much more fundamental to understand the utter violence and disintegration of our social norms under capitalism. So in this sense, I would like to stress, and I'll just ask one more question, then we bring it to the audience. I would like to stress how this Marxian analysis of the state is very different from the traditional left for unions, which is the Keynesian left. And I think given that we have an audience here that is a trade unionist, we need to stress this. What you both were pointing out is, in fact, that the alternative here is not more state, because the state is the capitalist state is based on exploitation of the working class in a very structural sense, and is that this conflict is what we need to keep in mind in order to actually try to move forward in a more humane way for a society that is not based on the utter destruction of human lives. So in this sense, do you think that what is happening with Palestine and the incredible solidarity that we've seen for the Palestinian people, who are ultimately workers, and those workers who are the most impoverished by these global colonial enterprises, do you think could be a way to figure out a novel identity that also brings traditional workers away from the idea that they can side with the state in order to somehow gain? And so this can the Palestinian question help the disillusionment about how the working class, if allied with the supposed state, can do better for themselves, and actually show how we need a struggle that is much deeper and potentially unites the workers, in fact, in opposition with a state that has always tried to conceal the violence of our economy?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have found the struggles against the genocide in Palestine, which is not over, by the way. Trump's so-called peace agreement is an absolute sham, and that should be pointed out as loudly and continuously as possible. The Israeli, very far right-wing, neo-fascist Israeli government has already effectively proclaimed its intention to resume the atrocities it was carrying out up until last week, as soon as it can, or as soon as it feels it is opportune for it to do so. And so we should all remain oriented toward fighting against and trying to constrain our own state's ability to continue supporting that genocide, which obviously the role of the American state has been absolutely central to allowing that to continue. But I think what you're bringing up is a question of, social movements and socialist strategy. And I think this is a really, really important question that we have to kind of think through, because clearly we've seen that the role of the trade unions has not been particularly positive in recent progressive struggles, with some notable exceptions. And so I think part of what we're seeing is a deficit in terms of the role of unions in being able to do the kind of deep organizing and mobilizing and so on that's necessary to prevent the emergence of some kind of horrific neo-fascist nightmare in the United States. I mean, if it's the case, just as Professor Wolff said, and I totally agree with everything that he was saying in terms of the erosion of the traditional political parties and the traditional representatives of capital in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and the total failure of liberal capital to do anything to halt the continued sliding into some kind of neo-fascist authoritarianism, which is one of the reasons why I think it doesn't make sense for the left to frame the progressive agenda, the progressive strategy, as being one of revitalizing capital. One of the reasons why that doesn't make sense is because the liberal capitalists have done absolutely nothing to prevent the rise of the right. They've done absolutely nothing to put the brakes on Trump. In fact, they've given him all the room in the world to pursue this aggressive agenda. And like Professor Wolff said, they haven't really done much to constrain him or stop him. So given that that's the case, any opposition to this emerging regime that's rapidly being consolidated by the likes of Stephen Miller and Donald Trump and others is going to have to come from below, and so it's going to depend on the ability of workers to mobilize in very, very large numbers to raise the cost to business and fractions of capital of even considering breaking to the hard right and embracing a kind of fascist agenda, which would indeed, in many respects, make things easier for them, but it would also create all new contradictions and difficulties. I think in the international arena, the trade policies of the Trump administration have been probably for the most part disruptive to business. We'll see what happens when quarterly numbers come out in November, but my bet is that it hasn't been entirely favorable for most multinational corporations, the kind of disruption that Trump has been causing. But regardless of that, they've still been giving him a huge amount of leeway to continue to pursue those policies. So I think we need a significant push from below to raise the cost to business, even beyond the chaos of Trump, to raise the social cost of embracing the right. And that is going to certainly have to come from outside the two major political parties. I think the left has to totally abandon the illusion that the Democratic Party is going to be transformed in a progressive, even social democratic direction. I think it has to totally abandon the illusion that the Democratic Party is going to throw up an individual candidate that can spontaneously call into being a working class movement. I mean, I'm with Professor Wolff. I think Zoran Mamdani is a very encouraging case. I support him completely, but I think it's very easy to see it as a shortcut to building the kind of real working class power that we need to simply vote in an election for somebody who is a progressive in the Democratic Party. That may work to win the mayoralty of New York one time, but over the longer term, we need a much deeper and more fundamental shift in the balance of social power in this country. And that's going to require more than just individual elections or one-off protests. It's going to require building a real working class socialist movement that can actually bring pressure to bear on the state and both major parties to take the interests of workers into account, which, barring a strong workers' movement, it won't, right? As we've seen over and over again, the only interests that matters are those of capital, unless the working class is able to bring some kind of counterpower to bear. So I think that insofar as the movement for Palestinian rights has had any impact on U.S. foreign policy, I think it's certainly an example to emulate in terms of how to approach thinking about these other issues that confront the working class today.
Yeah, and I guess the point is, yeah. So, go ahead, please.
For me, the interesting thing about the Palestine efforts of labor are illustrated by what the Italian labor movement was able to do, unlike most others. It was able not only to have an action at the docks about not loading ships going back and forth to Israel, etc., but then to call upon the fellow workers in the Italian labor movement and on the left in general to have one or two, I can't keep it straight, general strike days across Italy on the subject is a remarkable achievement. I would have expected it maybe in France, but it was very interesting to see it in Italy because it shows a labor movement able and willing publicly to go well beyond what? Well, now, Clara's question, the Keynesian. What is the Keynesian? The Keynesians, and I teach that stuff in the university, the Keynesian program, to be blunt, is reformist. It wants to get people who have no job to get a job. And as a Marxist, and I don't mean to be flippant, we ought to ask always, the goal, therefore, is to have even more people be exploited than are currently being exploited to get them a job. Here's the irony And this is a powerful argument for us to use to get the support of working people. The argument goes like this. If you have a big reform movement like the 1930s in the United States that won Social Security and won unemployment compensation and a minimum wage and 15 million jobs, federal jobs, amazing achievements, paid for, by the way, just as a footnote, with taxes on corporations and the rich. So anyone who tells you we can't do that in American politics, the answer is we already did. We don't have to apologize to anybody. But here comes the argument. We did those reforms which Keynesians urged on us and still do. But we left the control of the surplus in the hands of the capitalists. We never went that last step. And because we did, they had the wealth, the ability, and the incentive to undo the reforms. And the last 70 years of American history have been the history of undoing the reforms of the 1930s. So the lesson is not that reform and revolution are a choice, but if you want either of them, you got to have both of them. If you want a reform that doesn't disappear, you have to make the revolution. You have to join us in understanding that if you leave them with the surplus, you will always be talking truth to power, which leaves them with the power and us with the truth. And that's not a program we will ever get the working class to do again.
Yes, because the point here is that Trump is doing us a favor and showing us how this ideal by which if only growth continues to happen and productivity of labor continues to accelerate, supposedly the class struggle can be appeased or even forgotten about. And this is the foundation of Keynesianism, that it's enough for all of us to believe in economic growth, that we will all be on the same boat. And clearly what we're seeing today is a vivid manifestation of how this was really never the case, and how there is a necessity to think beyond that box, especially for the unions. I would like to say, given that I'm Italian, that what's fascinating about the Italian solidarity movement for Palestine, we had over 2 million people in the general strike for twice, 2 weeks in a row, weeks of people in the streets, never something, but it's at least 30 years that we haven't seen this level of mobilization in Italy. Completely unexpected in a country in which labor is weak, very weak, in which austerity has completely put into very precarious conditions the majority of workers who are accepting contracts of union contrast of €5 an hour. This is the level of weakness, and yet the capacity to mobilize different sections of workers, teachers, university students, grassroots unions. The grassroots unions took a huge role in the general strike and in support of the dockers and other workers. So this capacity to rethink what labor really is, I think, is part of the conversation I hope we will have in this lecture series, is to say we need to confront these challenges, but by also critically reassessing our own identity and how we want to go about understanding the capitalist system. I spoke enough, so I'm going to give now the word to Hanin Kawaja, who's a PhD student at the New School for Social Research, a wonderful comrade and friend, and she's going to read some questions from the audience that she's selected. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I'm just going to get into the questions. I'm going to try to merge similar questions together. So the first one I'll start with is, in how far is the state relatively independent from capital when we speak about factions of capital? It seems also from your story, I think this is a question for you, Steve. It seems also from your story that when looking at factions, there is a constant intertwining with different state-based groups. Another question is saying that given the moment of the informal US empire decline in Africa, given the remnant of the US informal empire in Africa, what does the political and economic crisis mean for African countries?
Should I answer?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's it. So to clarify on the point of relative autonomy, this was a concept that was developed by Marxian state theorists in the 1970s, especially Nikos Poulantzas and Ralph Miliband. And the basic idea is that, as I was saying earlier, the capitalist class can't rule directly. No, capitalists are not typically concerned with broad class-wide perspectives. They don't even necessarily see themselves as a class. They're competing with one another, and they're concerned primarily with their own individual bottom lines. So you need a state that can stand at some distance from individual capitalists and balance and negotiate the interests between different capitalists to create a ruling class consensus, to create and articulate the power of the ruling class. Poulantzas called it an unstable equilibrium of compromise, which is a big phrase, but I think it makes sense. It's always unstable, it's always contradictory, but the state has to assemble these competing interests into a coherent class perspective. And the state is somewhat autonomous from capital, but it's not completely autonomous from capital, right? It is still bound by and structurally integrated with the capitalist system. Its primary task is to make capitalism work. If capitalism stops working, you have rising unemployment, you have crisis, you have all kinds of problems that would result in popular dissatisfaction with whatever government's in power, as well as problems for the capitalist class. So the state has to be functional for capital accumulation. It has to make capitalism work. So it's structurally bound to reproduce the power of the capitalist class. And it does capitalist things, therefore, without needing to be told to do capitalist things by particular capitalists. So it acts in a capitalist way, and it supports the power of the capitalist class without necessarily being told what to do by, Jamie Dimon calling up the government every single morning and telling it what kinds of policies and strategies that it should pursue. So the state is autonomous from capital, but also integrated with capitalism. It has to articulate and organize the general long-term interests of the system as a whole. And of course, there are different connections between particular groups of capitalists and the state that are very deep, and that has to do, one can analyze that and see how those connections actually shape in a significant way the internal structure of state power. What parts of the state are the most important? What parts are the least important? Well, one of the biggest shifts in state power since the 1970s, for example, has been the increasing power of the central bank. Why? Well, partly because the rise of finance in the global economy, which is the nerve center of global capitalism, facilitating the movement of investment all over the world. And that sector of capital is very closely connected with the central bank. So the central bank is managing the problems that are the most important for holding together global capitalism. And that's tied to the fact that the financial sector has become the most powerful part of the capitalist class. So there's all kinds of interconnections between particular parts of capital and the state, which then shape the way that the state is structured. And it also shaped the way that capitalism is structured. What parts of the capitalist class are most powerful and most significant at a given time? And in my book with Scott Aquano, as well as my first book, which Clara mentioned earlier, we try to trace some of that through historically. In terms of what the crisis means for African countries, I have to say I'm not an expert on the political economy of Africa by any stretch, but I could broadly say that the shift that Trump has implemented of America First, an America First economic strategy, one of the many things that it does not have in common with a socialist policy of a more progressive economic strategy is precisely that it is based on America First. It is based on we keep our resources, we keep our wealth, and the rest of the world can screw off. And I think one of the major issues with that are questions of economic development and the debt that the American state and other European and North American countries owe to developing economies, but also what Professor Wolff was saying earlier, the urgent imperative to cooperate at a global level on dealing with the climate crisis. Right? He was mentioning employment relations, but I think the same point could be made with regard to climate change, which cannot be solved by any one country. Obviously, it requires a global cooperation, which is the antithesis to the kinds of market competitiveness that capitalist industrial strategies, such as that favored by Joe Biden and the Democrats, tend to act directly against. So we need a socialist vision for economic cooperation at a global level among European states, but also among emerging and developing economies to address the social and ecological problems that are only going to become more pressing. And that requires us to move beyond the framework of market dependence and market competitiveness.
The only thing I would add briefly about Africa would be that it's already been going on now for some years. African countries, companies, but also countries are still sending their delegations to London and Paris and Berlin to ask for loans or to promote investment. But instead of returning back to their African country after the mission, they go to China and India and Sao Paulo in Brazil, and they repeat the pitch because they are now able to play the one center, the declining center of capitalism, the West, against the ascending, rising power in the East. And remember, the collective GDP of China and the BRICS is now much greater. It's a wealthier bloc that you're going to help from than you are the old ones. And as a result, more and more development projects are happening in African countries in cooperation with China or India or Brazil or the BRICS. What Mr. Trump has done is accelerate that process. Why? Because he has taught a lesson to every company and country in the world. You do business with the United States, you're doing business with a desperado. They're going to hit you with a tariff. They're going to hit you with a ban, a sanction. Who the hell knows? It's not safe to associate yourself with them. If you depend on them for anything, a market, an input, try to find another place, because you will not encounter a wall of tariffs from other parts of the world, anything like what Mr. Trump is doing. So you are better off. These are the practical, everyday realities which are shifting the whole economic universe of Africa away from the West and to the East. And it's not just Africa. The same is happening in Latin America. The same is happening in parts of Asia. For that matter, it's being discussed even in parts of Eastern Europe, notwithstanding the Ukraine war. So we are watching. That's why I begin this way. We are in a transition. The world is reorienting itself, and we shouldn't take it lightly. Europe has been the center of the world in its own mind, but even through colonialism in a very practical way for many centuries. That's over. And that's not going to disappear the way it is going now without leaving all kinds of ambivalences, traces, contradictions in its wake. This is a major shift, dramatic as much as the Renaissance or the Reformation were when they brought Europe into the position it occupied for the last so many centuries.
Thank you. I'm going to move to an interesting question, I think, that I will read out, and then I'm going to add to it something that I'm also wondering about. So this is from Stacy, and she's saying that Ricks began by saying that people cherry pick. And in this case, Steve seems to be pulling numbers that are different from Ricks. So how do you justify this difference? I'll add to this by saying that it seems that there's agreement. The state is desperate, the working class are struggling, and the middle class is almost vanished. And there seems to be agreement that any movement needs to be grassroots. But I agree with Stacy. It seems that when you are looking at the question of whether the US is doing okay, Steve is looking at the strength of capital I think I would like to understand maybe more of how are you measuring, like, what is the strength of capital? Is it the financial market? And is this a statement that you are making on how the US has been doing thus far? Or are you saying that this strength, based on the information we have today, can and will continue because it is a tool that can sustain this strength? And then the flip side of that is goes to Wolff, and you're saying that we're seeing a decline and the dynamism. So Stephen is focusing on the financial aspect of the economy, to me it seems. But for you, Rick, you're focusing more on the dynamism, on the productive side of the economy, and you're saying that this has moved to the global south. And my question is for both of you, is this sustained? Can capital and financial markets continue to be the foundation that holds the US in its place? And if yes, how? And then for Wolff, I would ask, what is coming next? Because even though the dynamism has moved, and I agree with you, the US still seems to be in a position of power, at least politically, hegemonically, internationally, right? So what is the next piece of the puzzle that's going to fall? And for you, and then for Steve, what is the piece of the puzzle that will continue to hold it in its place? Or is that not the statement you're making?
That's a really thoughtful and very complicated question that gets, I think, at the heart of what we've been kind of talking about here. So I appreciate that, both Stacey and Hanin. So in terms of the strength of capital, the key argument I'm trying to make here is not at all to cherry pick. It's to try to make the case, which I think Marx makes in Capital, that unless there is a strong labor movement, the kind of Keynesian class compromise that Clara was just referring to a moment ago is off the table. And in fact, the strength of capital tends to come at the expense of the working class. I think there's this conflation that can happen, which is actually common to Keynesianism, of the interests of capital and the interests of workers. If the working class is doing poorly, if we're seeing social crisis, if we're seeing working class living standards declining, if we're seeing the working class left without healthcare, if we're seeing the expansion of unemployed and marginalized populations, then that must mean capitalism's falling apart. But actually, capital, the strength of capital, is predicated on those things happening. Unless there's a strong working class movement that can fight for the interests of the working class against capital, then that is exactly what the outcome will be. The accumulation of wealth at one pole and the accumulation of misery at the other pole. So it is necessary to build a working class movement to make things worse for capital in order for them to get better for the working class. So the decline of working class living standards and things getting worse for the working class is not the same as capitalism falling apart. As a matter of fact, it's the precise opposite. The strength of capitalism caused the weakness of the working class, and in fact was predicated on the weakness of the working class. And so we can look at profit numbers, right? Profits are at record highs. I don't think that's cherry picking. I think profitability is the central axis regulating the capitalist economy, the central factor regulating the capitalist economy, and profits are at record highs. I think you see at the global level, you see the role of the dollar internationally. It's true there's been a marginal decline in dollar holdings in recent years, but a lot of that in the past year or so has to do with the declining value of the dollar. So the value of those dollar holdings by central banks has declined relative to other currencies. It's also the case that if you look at the IMF reports that study reserve holdings internationally, the renminbi, the Chinese currency, has appreciated somewhat in terms of the central bank holdings of that as a reserve currency, but it's like 2%. The dollar is 50%. And the other currencies that have gained most in the past 5 years or so have been currencies that the Federal Reserve backed after the 2008 crisis with unlimited swap lines of credit. So part of the dollar being the international reserve currency also means that the Federal Reserve is the world's central bank. And it played that role after 2008 and even more during the COVID-19 crisis by supplying central banks all around the world with unlimited supplies of dollars, thereby backstopping and stabilizing those currencies. So if you look at the currencies that have appreciated most, more than the Chinese renminbi in terms of the share of reserve holdings globally, they're currencies that the Federal Reserve supported after 2008, and therefore demonstrated that in a moment of crisis, it stood behind those currencies. So what we actually see is diversification of reserve holdings based on the demonstrated backstop support of the Federal Reserve for this basket of currencies. And so investors can diversify and still benefit from the overwhelming power of the Federal Reserve to navigate crises. And that's exactly why gold and cryptocurrency and all the rest of it can't replace the dollar. There's no central bank standing behind gold in the event of a crisis. There's no central bank standing behind cryptocurrency, at least not yet, in the event of a crisis. So managing crisis requires the involvement of the state, and the US state has been very, very deeply involved and getting more so since 2008 in navigating these financial contradictions. The other point I would raise is that China is indeed becoming more powerful, and navigating the rising power of China is a significant challenge for the US empire. I totally agree with Professor Wolff on that. But one has to take account of the fact that China is thoroughly integrated with global capitalism. It is the second largest holder of American debt in the world. It is the second largest holder of American financial assets in the world, dollar assets. So China is thoroughly integrated with global capitalism. A huge proportion of Chinese exports come right to the US market. And China holds dollars so that its own currency doesn't depreciate and make its exports less competitive, right? So containing China, which is thoroughly integrated with global capitalism, is a very significant challenge that the American state has to navigate as it tries to protect its own power and its own ability to set the rules of the game. But it cannot just separate from China. And China cannot be understood as simply outside of, externally in conflict with the US system in the way that, say, the Soviet Union could, which was a completely separate economic system, or the inter-imperial rivalry of the pre-war and interwar periods was between different European powers clashing on the world stage. China is completely and very, very substantially integrated with global capitalism. And so managing that conflict is going to be hard. And the fallout of the tariffs and the inability of the tariffs to actually limit Chinese exports to the US is a direct sign of that. So I think there's all kinds of reasons to think that the American state remains the center of global capitalism. There is no alternative to the dollar is one of the most significant ones. So for all these reasons, I think it's better to understand the situation that the working class is in today in the United States in terms of its deteriorating living conditions as a consequence of the free mobility of capital, which has been at the core of the US empire, which has benefited capital enormously, but which has not benefited the working class. So we have to figure out strategies to break with globalization, to impose limits on capital, and to gain greater democratic control over investment in order to improve the position of the working class. And that's going to require a radical confrontation with the whole capitalist class. It's not like finance is benefiting at the expense of industry. Industrial profits are sky high. They're at record highs. So no part of the capitalist class is going to sign on to this program of breaking with globalization. They're both benefiting. So we have to wage a confrontation with the entire capitalist class to break with globalization and to take investment under more public and democratic control.
Thank you.
Well, it is a problem when you look at statistics, how you interpret them, and what you mean. I don't want to get into a dispute that'll get arcane in terms of this sort of thing. So let me go after the larger issue. Absolutely, the Chinese economy is intertwined with global capitalism. It was the way that the Chinese managed their relationship in the global capitalist system that brought them to the position they're in now, and they know it. It's an ongoing debate inside China about the pace at which they should disconnect from the dollar. And they are reminded by their own Marxist economists it was the framework of the dollar which enabled China to play the role and to become the powerhouse that it now is. And they don't want to cut that off before they're ready. And they have spent the last 10 years in an intense debate right to this minute about how far can they go when. And you saw it over this last weekend, right? They decided finally that they had enough with the maneuvers of Mr. Trump, with putting fees on Chinese-built vessels when they dock at ports, and they said no, no more of that. So we're cutting off the rare earth export license. You're not going to get it. And American defense needs that. Can't do without it. And the Chinese are overwhelmingly globally dominant in rare earth production and processing and so on. And so Mr. Trump had a meltdown, and the stock market crashed last Friday. And the day after, he had to walk it back. And so we had headlines here in the United States, Mr. Trump taco again. Trump always chickens out, TACO. Right? What is that about? That's China trying to figure out how far it can risk going with the United States. That's why yesterday the Mr. Hedgeseth, who has his head screwed on weird, started mumbling about nuclear weapons again. And the Russians came back to remind everyone they're allied with China, and if you do this nonsense with the nuclear weapons, the game is over, but not just for us. They are all maneuvering. The intertwinedness, it's like the conversation earlier, that's not an alternative to the struggle. It's part of the struggle. World Wars I and II were fought among capitalist, imperialist countries heavily intertwined with one another, and they destroyed each other. They destroyed each other. In World War I, there was nobody else. In World War II, Russia played a secondary role, even as the Soviet Union. They were intertwined. Nor is the Soviet Union a useful metaphor, because economically, it never was, to this day, an economic competitor of the United States. It was never big enough. Just look up the numbers. Russia is a small economic unit in the world compared to the United States and China, who are two colossuses confronting one another. That's the reality within which these issues are fought out. And my view, to make it real clear, my view is that there's an economic process underway here, and that the states in each case are secondary in their importance, secondary in the influence that they can have, most of the time catching up to developments that are out of their control. The profit numbers of the United States, the Magnificent Seven, the major 7 high-tech companies, that's a dominant source of profits. For vast swaths of American capitalism, profits are not very good these days. If you take out the 7, if you take out high-tech, it's a completely different story. Story of the stock market, story of distribution of wealth, story of power. There's a reason Mr. Trump is courting those people. It's a reason why at his inauguration he had them sitting right behind him. Everybody should understand who's the priority. He gave the capitalist class of this country a gift. That was his tax bill, the so-called big, beautiful tax bill that he passed a few months ago. That was his first priority. That was his first significant bill. That gave all employers a tax cut. That was there to shut them up, while he now went to work to build his alliance with the high-tech people in the hopes that he can hold together his shaky coalition, and it is very shaky, a bit longer, maybe until the election next year. And even that's not looking real good. He just lost Marjorie Taylor Greene. That may not mean much to any of you, but she's a remarkable congresswoman, a Republican right-wing extreme Trump supporter who in the last 2 weeks has decided She doesn't like Mr. Trump anymore. She won't go with him on the Epstein files. She won't go with him on cutting Medicaid. Wow, she's voting with the Democrats. She comes from deep red Georgia politically. What's going on here? He has an enormous problem, and here's perhaps the most important point. He can't solve the problem. The problem is the decline of the American empire and the impact it's having on the American capitalism. Your model should be Britain. Lost the empire, their capitalism is turning into excrement, and they know it. That's what's happening here. Mr. Biden couldn't do anything about it, nor could Mr. Obama, nor can Mr. Trump. And if I were a betting person, I would bet that what we're going to see in the months and years ahead is a working class that figures out what I just said and realizes that turning to the right as this system breaks down wasn't a smart move, because the right has no solution. It has theater, deporting immigrants, oh yes, and ICE and lots of political theater, but no solution to your problems, not at all. And you know what might happen then? That the American working class, which in the Great Depression of the 1930s lurched to the left, will do that again.
Thank you so much, Rick and Steve. Last two questions before we close. One says, Marlon Henry asks, what would be one key advice from the panel to trade unions and trade unionists right now amidst the doom and gloom described this evening regarding the continuing demise of the working class? That's one of them. And then the other one from Buzra, I hope I said it right. How can we redirect economic blame from migrants and foreign actors towards structural issues like regressive taxation, financialization, and absence of industrial policy when capitalist class owns traditional and social media? I see the public opinion on blame as the basis for mobilization. Thank you. On this last question, I also would like to mention that Democracy at Work, that Rick Wolff leads, and the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, freeforum.org, we do try to provide different narratives. And of course, this is also what SAPE and our alliance is trying to do. Yes, these two questions to conclude.
So I think the impoverishment and the limitation, in some cases self-imposed, on the trade union movement is one of the biggest handicaps that the working class, certainly in North America, the United States, has today. I think there needs to be a crusade, that the labor movement needs to form a labor-wide, class-wide struggle, first of all, to stop the fascist transformation of the American state, which is happening before our eyes. And it has to push for a political orientation that goes beyond simply one-off isolated pockets of strikes here and there, which is what we've basically seen in the recent past. Not that those pockets of resistance and protest aren't important and aren't inspiring, but we need to go beyond that. And at this point, it's getting quite dire. The world is crossing one climate tipping point after another. We have dangerous attacks on workers, and particularly migrants, happening every single day. We have a ruling class that, while it's profiting hand over fist, and it's not just tech, the energy sector, the oil companies are making record profits. Oil companies, I'm sorry to say, are making record profits. The auto sector, maybe the tariffs will hurt it, but the auto sector is making record profits. These are industries that have to be fundamentally transformed. And capitalism is not going to transform them on its own. Markets are not going to transform them on its own. They're going to have to be transformed by massive state intervention to close down and restructure entire sectors of the economy. And that's not coming from the representatives of capital. Why? Because it's not in the interest of capital to abridge property rights in the way that would be required to expand state planning in the ways necessary to do a green transition, to undertake a green transition. So workers are facing a capitalist class that is strong and that is profiting from ecocide, that is profiting from immiseration, that is profiting from genocide. We have a liberal elite that just sat by and participated fully in the attempted eradication of an entire civilization in the Middle East. And that expanded that violence to then encompass Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and to assert what is effectively a reboot of the neocon project throughout the entire region. And that's going to continue and be spread to Latin America unless something is done to stop it. And we cannot count on the liberal capitalist elite that back the Democratic Party to do it, because they're benefiting from it as it is. And so it's going to require us to build an independent working class movement to take those issues on. And that requires a fundamental transformation of what trade unions are and how they work. It requires those unions to take on the deep organizing and educating of their members that they gave up on long ago. And it's not just about radical posturing. It has to be about building meaningful base in the working class for an alternative politics. And it can't be tied to the Democratic Party because, again, we've seen over and over again since the 1930s what happens when the left goes into the Democratic Party thinking it's going to transform it. We need to build an independent politics. It has to be grounded in the working class. It has to, I would argue, attract the support of the trade union movement and be based in unionized working class members of the working class. One place to start could be Amazon, right, which is an incredibly profitable corporation that does logistics, retail, delivery, et cetera, and is the largest employer or the second largest, depending on how you look at it, in the United States. So this labor crusade that I'm mentioning could begin with Amazon. There's no reason why it shouldn't. There's large numbers of workers working in one place there. You have, in many cases, thousands of workers in one facility working shoulder to shoulder in incredibly difficult conditions. The labor union, the labor movement should take that on as a class project. And organizing Amazon could fundamentally transform the working class. It could raise expectations about the possibilities for collective struggle. And it could point in all kinds of directions, including the need for a green transition, because Amazon, of course, is antithetical to that in terms of how all of its infrastructure is set up. So I think the fundamental thing that activists have to be doing today and that the left should be doing today is coming up with a clear analysis of what's going on and using that analysis to guide a strategy of building a working class movement to take on a capitalist system that is not capable, that has proven itself incapable of taking on the kinds of changes necessary to safeguard the human future as ecological collapse is intensifying all around us. So for me, that is the starting point. And I think initiatives like this one and Clara's project in Tulsa, the Free, is, I think, the absolutely essential centers of political education that are all too quickly abandoned as unserious or risking the credibility of the left once you go into the circles inhabited by trade unions and left academics, right? They want to dismiss these projects as hampering their credibility. But I think it's maintaining a socialist analysis and doing the kinds of political education that we're talking about doing and actually doing in this very moment that are essential to building a better future.
I would only add, I don't want to repeat what Steve said. I would only add that I have a lot of confidence in working people to creatively find the ways that make sense to them to make change. And so I focus myself in my conditions in my life on trying to figure out what has held them back. And in my judgment, what has held them back is the ideological prevailing ideas about the situation, which is that the system they live in is the optimum one, that if it has some flaws and failures, they can be identified and fixed, that we don't have a systematic problem, we don't have a systemic issue to overcome. And if that's what you believe, then you're not going to go and join the new political force. You're not going to be critical of your own labor leaders if they're going to fix this or that particular problem. And maybe doing a good job of doing it, too. I don't want to be in a position of criticizing them. I want to be in the position, and I urge it on all of you. Don't hesitate to say in all the circles where you are active what has not been said in our culture anywhere near enough. That we have a particular system, it's called capitalism, and that's the problem. In the end, that if we don't get rid of that, it will either block us from getting the fix we want, or even if we're successful and we get the fix we want, so long as we leave that system, it will take it back. Let me conclude. The parallel is with the struggle against slavery. There were always people who were outraged that the master gave the slave too little food or too few clothings or inadequate shelter, and they went to work, good people, to give the slave better conditions. But that's not who we are. Ours is the role. The problem isn't your diet or your outfit or your house. The problem is you're a slave. If you get the master to give you better, you're still leaving him as the master who can take away what you get him to give. Do you really want for yourself and your children to accept it? The proof here in the United States, again, right here in New York City, where the ideology is thicker than anywhere, is that the mass of the people are now saying they want a socialist for mayor. These are people who could not tell you exactly what socialism is, not even roughly, but they know what they don't want, and they are open to hearing the story of a different system. If we don't do it, who is? That's our job.
That was fantastic. I hope that the spirit of this lecture series is not to depress ourselves, but actually to gain those conceptual tools that do allow us to see the systematic issues and thus have come with this our courageous solutions that we can all think about together. And the point is that I guess part of the conversation between academics and other sectors of civil society is exactly to say we can provide what we're good at, the broader analysis of capitalism, but this has to be worked in combination with what you are good at, which is actually understanding the daily struggles and putting into practice alternatives. So it can't come from the academics. Academics can give insights that need to be concretized in the real struggles, in the real organizing. And the real organizing is, I hope, what all of these lectures will inspire to do more of. Thank you so much for being with us, Richard Wolff and Stephen Maher. Thank you, Hanin. Hanin has been one of the crucial organizers of the whole lecture series. Thank you, Juani, and we will see each other on the 29th of October for a conversation on militarism. That is a perfect segue in terms of conversation. See you all very soon. Thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.